you for this 3-day conference at the Paris School of Economics. Under this, in Paris, under this beautiful spring weather. We're your hosts for this conference, and I'm chairing this opening session of the DebtCon7. You all know that DebtCon is an annual conference. It prides itself of being the best conference in fairly narrow field. The conferences on sovereign debt, where you can get a temporary tattoo. That was the case until last year because Anna forgot the tattoos in Washington. So I hope she gets to bring them. But I think she get a way to get them to us. So this is very packed 3 days, and I wanted to start by doing 2 things. First, to formally welcome you, and I'll ask in just a couple of seconds, Claudia Senik, the director of the CEPR, which is the lab's institutional home, to come and welcome you, and Jean-Olivier Hérault, the director of the Paris School of Economics, which are the 2 co-organizing institutions. And the second part will be to pay tribute to the memory of Daniel Cohen, who passed away last August. He founded the lab and was the president. He was also the director of CEPR and the president of the Paris School of Economics. So in Princeton last year, when Anna, Hugo, and Lena suggested the idea of organizing this edition in Paris, I was flattered, a little bit startled by the trust that they put in our young institution, which was at that time not even a year old. When I landed back from Princeton, I called Daniel immediately and to ask him what he thought, and he was enthusiastic. He was already at the hospital at the time, but was convinced, as we all were, that he would be back on his feet by the summer. And he had already planned, I mean, when we, on our first conversation, he was already planning the conference, planning the collaboration between CEPR, the lab, the PSE. And now, of course, it's hard for me to believe that we're holding this first day of the conference here in the auditorium that is now named after him. So this is a motion that I want to leave the floor to Claudia to say a few words, and then to Jean-Olivier.
Martin, you said everything I wanted to say. I say it's a great pleasure for me as a new director of CEPR to open this 7th edition of the Interdisciplinary Sovereign Debt Research and Management Conference, DebtCon, better. So the stated objective of the conference is to find creative solutions for urgent debt policy challenges, and the world is obviously not short of such challenges in face of higher interest rates and climate change in particular. As you said, the morning we start with a tribute paid to Daniel Cohen, who was the director of CEPR for almost 20 years and created the FDL, Finance for Development Lab, within CEPR with Ishac Diwan and Martin Kessler. And I remember the enthusiasm of Daniel when he launched this project. And so I think back in 2021, if I remember. And so I'm thrilled that we're today hosting this prestigious conference, and I look forward to seeing the outputs of this gathering. And I'll leave you with these few words. Thank you.
So, Jean-Olivier Hérault,
hello everyone. So I'm director of Paris School of Economics. I'm very pleased to say a few words to open this conference. So on sovereign debt research and management. As has been said already, first organized by Paris School of Economics and collaboration with the CEPR Finance for Development Lab. So I'm very pleased, especially because this conference is emblematic or features all the dimensions of what Paris School of Economics likes to promote, mixing academic and policy debates, research, discussion with some implication, a strong implication for policies, mixing several disciplines, economics, but also political science, sociology, law, finance, and certainly many others. And that's the reason I'm sure that the presentation and discussion during these 3 days will be very useful and will benefit practitioners for their action and strategies. And as been said by Martin and Claudia, it's also a very special event for Paris School of Economics, as it brings together the institutions that have been created by Daniel Cohen in his career, in his life, Paris School of Economics, CEPR and the lab, the Finance for Development Lab. And organizing together this conference is to pay collective tribute to him. And I'm sure that this conference will be as inspiring and stimulating as Daniel was. So thank you very much for attending. I'm sure that will be very stimulating, as I said, 3 days. And I hope it will be a very nice stay in Paris, in Paris School of Economics. Thank you very much.
So, merci beaucoup, Olivier, Jean-Olivier. So now I wanted to ask Anna, Ugo, and Lena to speak a bit about what DebtCon is, what it has been in the past years. I don't see Lena, but maybe Anna, Ugo, you can choose first.
The special DebtCon dance. So first of all, thank you to Martin and to the FinDev Lab community for hosting this, for welcoming all of us. And we welcome you to the roving DebtCon family. So DebtCon, I think, and you can correct me, we're about 2 basic commitments. One is a commitment to crossing every kind of boundary we can find, and another is a commitment to getting together again. And both are substantive commitments. So every panel, we hope, unless something has gone badly wrong, will have speakers and thinkers from different disciplines, from the public and the private sector, from the academy and from practice. So if you find yourself in a room that looks like it's all economists, something went wrong, you're probably not at DebtCon. If you find yourself in a room with folks from all the same country or the same continent, again, you probably just check the map. That is not what we're about. And we're really, again, so grateful to Martin and to FDL for continuing this tradition, and for, we've been extraordinarily lucky. We've been marrying up each time. When we started this in the middle of a snowstorm at Georgetown, we're kind of like, oh my God, can we do this again every year? And then, of course, Ugo and Geneva just threw a party to end all parties, and here we are. We are waiting to expand the empire to poets and artists and musicians, stand-up comedians. I don't know if anybody noticed that the official name of the conference is, SDRM. And there's an inside joke on every other page. But really, the big hope is to have a community that is equal to the human, economic, political, existential problem that is sovereign debt. And we're so grateful that everyone here and everyone watching is a part of this. Let's try to make it better. Thank you.
I'm just saying one word. So in this conference, I free ride on the work of Anna, Martin, and Lena. So I always get listed among one of the organizers without doing much work. So, but thank you for doing all the work. And just want to say again, with Martin and everybody who spoke before, that it's a great honor to be in an auditorium named after Daniel Cohen, because actually and also to have Richard here, because when I started reading about debt, I was basically reading papers by Daniel and Richard. And that's so it's well, it's very sad that Daniel is not with us, but I think it's a wonderful way to honor his memory. Thank you.
So now we turn to the second part of the session, and we have several short testimonies, some pre-recorded, some live, and I'll thank everybody to have taken the time to do this. Maybe just two things before to set the scene. First, there was already a beautiful event in September here in this auditorium, which highlighted Daniel Zoll as a researcher, an inspiring professor, and a formidable public intellectual. As an intellectual, his popular books in France, but also abroad, were immensely successful. There's at least 2 generations of students that they opened INSEAD to, and he thought deeply about a broad range of issues: social policy, the benefits and ills of technical progress, decline of growth in advanced economies, and its political, its sociological consequences. He came to economics from mathematics, but his books are filled with dialogues with other disciplines, whether they are philosophy, sociology, psychology, but also literature. As a professor, many of his students have gone on to do absolutely brilliant careers, and he was very good at finding very talented young people, like Esther Duflo, Thomas Piketty, the late Emmanuel Fary, and many others, who were not necessarily convinced that they wanted anything to do with economics, and showing them how this discipline could illuminate the world. I was a much less brilliant student than them, but like many, I was enchanted by how we could use the mathematic models to say very deep things about the world. I kept in touch regularly, somewhat infrequently, but then towards the summer of 2021, through Hamouda was here, he had come up with the idea of creating a center working on development finance and sovereign debt here within the CEPR. And he asked me to be the executive director of this center. And for me, this year of working with him has been the most rewarding moment of my career. He's no longer here, but he gave me the privilege to among many other things, to stand here today and organize this conference. And I'm immensely grateful to him for that. Lastly, and before the video, I want to mention a few things as a researcher on debt. And I read in the past few months the first book that he published, which is here, Private Lending to Sovereign States, Theoretical Autopsy. It's an edited version of his PhD that he published in 1991. And I think it resonates a lot with the theme that we chose for this conference. It asks, what does it mean to default? That defaulting on external debt, and I quote, is indeed a typical tool of domestic sovereignty, with the implication that default is a decision that is voluntary under major constraints, but a voluntary decision nevertheless. And he tries to get the consequences of thinking about that strategic decision. In the book, which looks back at the 1980s, he also highlights how much of a surprise this extended period of zero growth and high real interest rate had been to any banker that was educated in the 1960s. And we can see the parallel now for a bond investor educated in the 2000s or the 2010s facing the situation today. Other important themes in the book are the difficulty to distinguish between solvency and liquidity, how to organize the debt buyback to reduce the tensions on debt, and how growth is related to debt and how it can be stunted by high debts. So all of the themes we'll mention throughout the sessions today, and I think rereading that you can show in a way that you can see in a way that in a way it's a bit depressing. That we are just repeating things that were thought about in the 90s and 1980s, but in a way it's reassuring. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, and that includes Daniel. Now, with that, I'll launch a video of a few people who recorded the message. Hope it works.
Hello, as this 7th edition of DebtCon
Hello,
as the
Paris.
7th edition
Daniel
of
Cohen will be
DebtCon
missed
going
more than
Paris.
ever.
Daniel Cohen will be missed more than ever. Daniel was one of a kind, an economist who combined deep technical skills with a remarkably wide range of interests, and a public intellectual who informed and influenced policy debates in France and abroad, in the tradition of philosopher-economists from the 18th and 19th centuries. A great teacher whose students are who's who of top French economists, and an institution builder, including at both of this year's hosts, the Paris School of Economics and the Finance for Development Lab. In straightforward language and with crystal clear reasoning, Daniel insisted on describing things as they were, how the true quantum of debt relief depends on that debt's real market value, or why we must recognize when a country is insolvent. But whether he was looking at sovereign debt crisis or the impacts of structural economic change, he always kept people and their prospects at the center of his work. It was this combination of rigor, honesty, and humanism that made Daniel's analysis so powerful and so appealing to the public. It's also why his absence leaves such a void. Daniel and I met during my time as senior advisor to Lazard, working on sovereign debt issues. Daniel was our equivalent of a brain box, a chief economist whose incisive analysis guided our work. Today, many of the world's poorest economies are being battered by a new wave of debt distress as the costs of climate change add to the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis made worse by war in Ukraine, and monetary tightening advanced economies. As the DebtCon organizers put it with considerable understatement, quote, sovereign debt architectures getting more complex, unquote. We have seen some progress. There has been some restructuring under the G20's common framework, though that has been quite slow. Thanks in great measure to the leadership of Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, climate disaster contingencies are a growing feature of official loan packages. Nevertheless, Daniel would almost certainly have been telling us this week that we had not done nearly enough. Larry Summers and N.K. Singh recently estimated that rising interest rates and bond and loan repayments meant that in 2023, nearly 200 billion flowed out of developing countries to private creditors, an amount vastly exceeding the increase in support from international financial institutions. Solutions exist. We must work faster to restructure debts and reform international financial institutions so they can vastly step up concessional financing for poor countries that need it. None of this will be easy, but the human and economic cost of failing to do so will be immense. Back in 2006, for the 50th anniversary of the Paris Club, Daniel wrote that it had been created, and I quote, on the premise that countries may face transitory debt problems which could be solved by cooperative agreements of the creditors. The world of sovereign debt has changed beyond recognition since the 1950s or even 2006. We know that debt problems can drag on for years and weigh on countries' growth and development for even longer. One constant remains the need for cooperation. We will need cooperation among all creditors, traditional and new, public and private, to restructure unpayable sovereign debts promptly and comprehensively. And as DG of the WTO, let me add that we'll need continued cooperation on trade so that poor countries do not find it even harder to export and earn foreign exchange. Something else we will need, as the conference organizers said, is new insights. I'm confident that you'll come up with ideas that will make Daniel proud, because I'm convinced he's tuning in by celestial Zoom to the conference. Thank you, and I wish you a productive DebtCon7.
I would like to take you back to 2010, the beginning of the Greek and broader Eurozone financial crisis. At the end of 2009, a new Greek government had been elected and had come clean about the dire situation of the public finances in Greece. So we were facing a rapidly closing window in terms of being able to borrow at sustainable rates from international financial markets. During this period, as the new finance minister, I would receive in my office a constant stream of visitors. Some were international banks that wanted to lend us at higher and higher premia. Others were consultants or experts on international debt and financial markets. Among this latter group, a couple of people stood out, and one of them was Daniel Cohen. Daniel stood out because of his brilliance. He stood out because of his technical expertise. He stood out as somebody who had a deep understanding of financial markets and sovereign debt. But he also stood out for something else. He stood out because all his technical solutions were embedded into a deep understanding of the policy and political process and showed empathy about the country that was and its plight during this particular period. Over the next weeks and months, we worked closely with Daniel to figure out different possible solutions, initially from reprofiling of the Greek debt to eventually solutions of deeper debt restructuring. Solutions, some of which were ahead of their time because at the time they were not accepted by our European partners. But Daniel was always trying to find a solution that was technically possible, elegant, but a solution that would be compatible with the needs of both the markets, but also the policymakers that would need to sign off on it. I last met Daniel in 2017. I was no longer in government. I had finished a book on the Greek crisis, and I was in Paris. And I called him up. We met at his office at the Paris School of Economics, and I rediscovered the same brilliant person that I knew from the crisis, somebody who had a clarity of mind and attention to detail that was only matched by a warm personality, a genuinely great human being who believed that the economics profession was to help people, who would combine his analytical ability with policy understanding to help find solutions in impossible situations. Daniel will be greatly missed.
What can I say about Daniel? Our paths crossed in the late 80s in Paris. In the context of CEPR, during one of the gatherings of economic policy to which he was a frequent contributor of articles on debt management and policy, working closely with Richard Portes and Georges de Menil. His intellectual rigor, his deep interest in public policy, and his authentic commitment for common good impressed me enormously. He was different. Thinking and writing about economics was for Daniel a means to make the world a better place to be. He was a citizen of this world, deeply worried about its democratic and governance deficiencies. Bold enough to speak up, to castigate in his most recent books the one-dimensional pursuit of material gains and the progressive domination of our lives by Homo economicus, the lost prophet of modern times, as he said, the misfortunes of prosperity and the rise of inequality and poverty in Western societies. He foresaw the rise of the ultra-right in our societies, the dangers for the workings of democracy, and warns against the progressive delegitimization of the European experiment. Being a man of action, the effective implementation of policies concerned him deeply, which led him eventually to found the Finance for Development Lab at the service of developing countries. As early as 2004, at the OECD Development Center, which I headed, we worked together to understand better the motives and choices of multilateral and bilateral donors and make policy recommendations to the DAC community regarding needed improvements in aid architecture and delivery. 5 years later, as a senior advisor to Les Arts, a well-known financial advisory company that advised successive Greek governments on debt restructuring, he played a pivotal role from the beginning of the crisis as a liaison with the IMF, as a technical advisor, as a go-between to unlock negotiations. What was exceptional was his sincere efforts and commitment to enable the restructuring of debt and avoid the adoption and pains of unprecedented austerity measures. In my capacity as minister, and then as head of the Hellenic Banking Association, I knew I could rely on one of the best and most trustworthy advisor and close friend. Spending time with Daniel at our house in Kea, overlooking the Aegean, exchanging views, ideas, worries, and aspirations remains one of the unforgettable experiences of my life. My deepest condolences to Martin, Pauline, all his family, friends, and many, many colleagues whose life he affected. Dearest Daniel, we all miss you.
Daniel et moi avions au moins 3 points communs. Nous sommes tous les deux nés à Tunis. Nous avons tous les deux commencé par des études scientifiques et une agrégation de mathématiques. Daniel a très vite bifurqué vers l'économie. J'ai mis beaucoup plus de temps avant de suivre son chemin. Nous avions également un autre point commun. Mon fils aîné et sa fille, Pauline, ont fréquenté le même lycée. Pauline un peu plus jeune que mon fils aîné. Et je me souviens des nombreux échanges que j'ai pu avoir avec Daniel, particulièrement stressé par la procédure d'orientation post-bac. Mais plus sérieusement, c'est au moment de la révolution tunisienne, en 2011, que nous sommes beaucoup rapprochés, notamment, et je lui en suis extrêmement reconnaissant, Daniel a apporté ses éclairages, ses conseils et son soutien pour la préparation du programme que nous avions présenté au G8 de Deauville, un programme pour relancer l'économie tunisienne. Et cela avait donné lieu à l'époque d'ailleurs à toute une série de tribunes publiées simultanément dans de nombreux journaux de par le monde, à commencer par le quotidien Le Monde, mais également la Repubblica, des journaux aux États-Unis, en Allemagne, en Autriche, en Suisse, en Tunisie, évidemment, pour soutenir la dynamique économique tunisienne post-révolution. C'est également Daniel qui m'a fait rencontrer Ishac Diwan, son complice dans la création du FinDevLab. Et pour tout cela, je lui demeure extrêmement reconnaissant et je suis heureux de pouvoir en témoigner très modestement, de l'apport de Daniel au quotidien sur de très nombreux sujets, avec toujours le plus grand intérêt et la plus grande vivacité, avec un attachement tout particulier aux questions qui étaient en lien avec la Tunisie.
I remember meeting Daniel long ago. It was such a breath of fresh air. He was always so motivated, so excited, especially to talk about debt-related issues. I learned a lot from him. He was really an inspiration to me and to many of us who worked with him on these very difficult, challenging issues. He is going to be very much missed. I already miss him in these times where we are struggling with the challenges. It's sad to see him go, but he will always remain in our thoughts, in our hearts. I also want to say on behalf of myself and my husband, Mark Dutz, who was inspired by him to do a PhD in economics. He was with him as an intern in the debt division of the World Bank, and then went on to do a PhD. We met Daniel the last time in person in Washington, D.C. We went to dinner together. The whole time he was so excited talking about how we can make a difference and how we can support countries, how we can help countries. And then, of course, we talked about his real passion, which was his daughter. And it was so moving to see him so excited about sharing things with her. So I don't want to say goodbye. As I said, he's always going to be in our thoughts and in our hearts.
So I think that the idea was to case about then as a researcher and as a practitioner, and for that we have, like to have his co-authors and partners in I don't know, but in action. So I'll call Ishac. Sorry, that's my order of thought. But maybe if you can, I think we have 7 people. So maybe Ishac. I forgot the other. I think Thierry. Richard and Hélène, if you could go on stage and another round, thank you. And Isaac, you'll start, and there are mics here. Ah, et je vais mettre la photo. La photo? Ouais, je mets la photo. Okay.
Well, much have been said already. Richard, I don't know if you're in the picture here. So much has been said. Daniel, I knew Daniel since the late 80s when this picture was taken. You can look for him in there. Maybe you'd recognize other people. This was during a conference in 1988 on the debt crisis of Latin America. We came up with the book then, and he wrote an article in the book called How to Deal with Over-Indebtedness, Reduce Flows Rather Than Stocks. Sounds familiar. If you look in the picture, you would see Eduardo Borzenstein, Guillermo Calvo, Stein, Claessens, Bill Easterly. I think Danielle is between Bill and Guillermo. Richard, I think you're in the picture, but you were much younger. Asle Dimerkok, you'd recognize many people in here. This kind of the early literature of the late 80s, the early 90s. So this is maybe my first encounter with Daniel. A second encounter where we spent a lot of time together was in '95 at the birth of the Economic Research Forum for the Middle East and North Africa. He was there with Danny Roderick, Stan Fisher. This was the middle of the Oslo peace process. There was a lot of excitement in the Middle East then, and since then, whenever I met Daniel, we started our talking about the Middle East. Elyes talked about, that's a side of Daniel that's not very well known, that he was born in Tunis, very interested in Egypt. He participated in the Egypt adjustment plan. He was very involved in the Lebanese crisis recently. And so that's one aspect, I think, of him that's not very well known. A third station I recall vividly is during my years in Africa, in Ethiopia, and then in Ghana in the early 2000s. Debt reduction, HIPAA, completion point, PRSCs. He was at the OECD and French development group then, the AFD, and we would discuss a lot these issues. I remember even a bit later when, say, Ethiopia borrowed first Eurobond, and then he was advising them on that. We had long discussions about whether it's a good idea or not, and how these Eurobonds borrowing by very frontier countries will end up. Of course, the last encounter was the FDL. That was the last adventure with Hamouda and with Martin, and now a much larger family. So Daniel was really the engine there, and all we do now, new finance, debt, MDB reforms, China, was initiated then, and we still vividly remember discussions we had with him. And since still now, when we move in a certain direction, we would remember what he thought about particular issues. Our last article together a project syndicate was called Development Financing at a Crossroads. And there we kind of compare two possible roads that this particular crisis could take. Either a kind of a mega default from on the markets, or somehow managing to pass this difficult moment and get back to the market. And as you can imagine, his choice was the second option. And it was probably the motto of his life. Don't close on yourself. Stay open to the world. Keep connecting with the world.
So actually, because there's enough seats, maybe Pierre Jacquet, Amouda Shekir, and Alexandra, if you can all sit on the table, and I'll just call, so Thierry, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a great emotion for me to be here and to pay a tribute to Daniel. I think that this conference on international debt and management is really probably the most important place where you can pay a tribute to him, given his intellectual interests, and which were many. But when I met him, actually, it was really about international debt problems that I got fascinated by his personality and his stature. When I see that book, Private Lending to Sovereign States, it was actually my Bible when I was a student. When I met Daniel, I was a young student. It was the summer of 1989. And I was looking for a research topic for my dissertation. And I met him, and I was immediately fascinated by the exuberance, intelligence, and his enthusiasm for research. And it was the moment where it was the international debt crisis of the 80s and 90s. And so he told me immediately, well, you want to work on that? Why don't you come with me to the World Bank in the summer as a summer intern? And then we'll work on something together. And I said, yes. And so we went there, and it was a fascinating experiment for me because the research department of the World Bank at the time was where all the people working on those topics were passing through. You had Jonathan Eaton, you had Mark Gersovitz, you had Jeff Sachs, you had Ishac Diwan that I met. And so I met a number of people there, and that's completely changed my perception and my view on how to do research in economics on policies about international debt. And it's the moment where actually I worked probably the most in my lifetime, 3 months, and I had almost 3 or 4 chapters of my dissertation down. One of them actually started with Ishac. I had actually with him a paper which was I remember it was on political economy of debt adjustment, where it was one of the few first papers where we were mixing politics and economics to understand what were the redistributive issues about debt reimbursement and how to deal with that, and what were the interest groups that were imposed or in favor of that in the political decision-making process for canceling the debt or reimbursing the debt. Another paper that actually, then I worked with Daniel actually at the time, 2 papers, 2 chapters of my dissertation. One was on the name of it was, I think, Bargaining, International Debt Negotiations and Growth, where essentially what we were doing is taking one of the chapters of this book and bringing together a bargaining model of negotiation between creditors and debtors, and trying to understand what were the growth implications of that in an endogenous growth model. The people who are economists here in this room know the Romer model of endogenous growth, and it was basically applying this to that context and understanding what were the consequences for the type of policies, whether the country had to take into account reserves or not, some technical issues. But really, I was fascinated by his capacity to grasp immediately a policy issue and bringing together into a formal framework. And the second paper, which actually we published together, is a more sort of interesting paper, which was at the time of the big debate about debt buybacks. And debt buybacks, where there was a whole discussion in the 80s about whether or not when you give money to a country, that country should use that money to try to buy back his debt on the secondary market. Because of the debt problems, his liabilities were discounted. There was a discount, and some people say, well, why don't we just try to give the money and rather to use that to reduce the face value of his debt? And that will be good. of course, the debate was hard and hot, and there are a lot of people working on that. You had Ken Rogoff and Jeremy Bullough. You had Jeff Sachs, you had Paul Krugman, and a bunch of people, brilliant young economists at the World Bank working on this. And the consensus at the end was that no, there was no reason why a country, when you give the money to the country should use that money to repay its buybacks, to buy back its debt. The reason is simple. It's because at the moment where the country was doing that, all the creditors would realize that actually the country was more able to pay the rest of the debt because the debt was reduced. So the price of the debt on the secondary market was just going up and wiping out all the possible benefits of that operation. And then Daniel looked at me and said, doesn't make sense. I said, why? Are all those brilliant people telling that actually it makes sense not to give the money for that? I said, yes, but you know, there's a moment at which if the country is able to do that secretly, without the creditors looking for it, even if the creditors know about it, but they cannot observe it completely because the country can use whatever it means in terms of financial intermediaries or other agents to buy the debt for him, then yes, in that case, that might be actually worth for the country to buy back its debt secretly. I said, wow, you think really it works? I'm not sure it works in all circumstances, but I think it's worth looking for it and trying to figure out when it works. So we started to write a model, and we worked a model on this, and we spent weeks and weeks doing that. And at some point, yes, it came out. The result was that if the country could buy the debt, not a little bit, not too much, but in a sort of a middle range, then yes, even if the creditors were aware of that possibility but could not observe it directly, then yes, in that case, the discount on the secondary market was not wiped out completely, and it could be in the interest of the country to do that from sort of the welfare of the country. And so we wrote the paper and sent it, and it was published. But what is the most important, interesting feature about this story is that a couple of years later, when there was the Brady plan, and the US government was pushing for the cancellation of the debt, the forgiveness of the debt of Mexico, they sat at the table and looked at what was on the table to be renegotiated and canceled. And they figured out that actually out of the liabilities of the Mexican country, about something like 25% was missing. And this 25% was actually debt that Mexico bought back secretly through very clever financial intermediaries. So again, that's just an example to show how smart and how intuitive Daniel was in terms of his insights in economic analysis. And for all this, I will miss him, definitely. Thank you very much.
Hélène, so now after Daniel, the researcher and practitioner with the evidence.
Thank you very much. Yes, my testimony to Daniel today is more on the practitioner side. So I'm working at the French Development Agency, and when I first met Daniel was in 2006, actually. I was working with Pierre, who was a chief economist at this moment, and we were reconsidering restart lending to poor countries, especially in Africa. And because since 1990 and the Label Conference, France was providing grants only to listed countries. And after all the EPIC initiatives and the multilateral debt reduction initiative, we had some space to relend to those countries. But we were very aware that debt overhang was still smoothing, and we wanted to avoid that lending would create a new debt crisis. So we wanted and we needed to be innovative and to create a new financial instrument. So Daniel was our man. So we know that he was very knowledgeable on the debt treatment, and he worked extensively on the determinant
element of debt overhang on volatility and vulnerability. So we started to have a very strong discussion with him, and it helped us actually to define a new debt instrument as a French development agency, the very concessional counter-cyclical loan. What I remember starting those discussions is really his gaze. He had a really piercing, smart and enthusiastic look on the topic. He was very excited at the idea to put in application, to change things and really to have a kind of transformative impact on lending, at least from the French perspective. He was really exigent. He knew that, of course, implementing was key. And a lot of colleagues have already mentioned that Daniel was a tremendous, brilliant academic, but he was also a practitioner. He was really attentive to implementation, to impact, and to changing things through policy and through understanding as a whole the situation. At this time, so we succeed after several months in putting in place this new instrument. IFD have granted some loans to poor countries. So we started this lending in 2007. Of course, the challenges was to embark the donors community. At this stage, Daniel was really in advance of phase because the counter-cyclical loan was unfortunately the French agency instrument only. But now, a lot of debt suspension initiative, a lot of climate instruments are blooming, and I'm sure that Daniel would be very proud of that. I guess it would be very exigent because really he mentioned that having impact, working on triggers is really important. And I guess he would question the impact of all this new debt instrument blooming now. And I think it will miss you and it will miss us. And I would like really to pay tribute to him today, on top of being a brilliant academic, being a very, very kind human mensch, as we said. And we will really miss him nowadays. Thank you.
I would like to invite Pierre Jacquet, the former chief economist of the AFD and now professor at Dauphine.
Thank you very much. It's with deep emotion that I take part in this tribute to Daniel. We have been connected for many decades, more than 4 decades. I remember we met as lost French people in the United States, in the Boston area when he was visiting there, and he was working with Jeff Sachs. And I'm sure that his interest already on sovereign debt was sustained by the Mexican default in August 1982. We stayed in touch, but we really started working together when I became chief economist of the AFD starting in 2002. And I remember Daniel had two concerns which I shared. The first one was to really understand what official development assistance was. It's a bizarre animal. It's using taxpayers' money to help developing countries develop. And the way in which it was regarded by most people was the technical aspect of aiding development. But the political substract, the political dimension of aid was forgotten. And Daniel had in mind that it was an instrument that was really based on deep politics. And yet we needed to find ways to understand it and use it as best as we could for development purposes. And we worked together to explain this complexity in a report to the Council of Economic Analysis, of which I was both of us were members at the time. And we joined forces together with Sylviane Guillemont-Jeannet to produce a report on the French development assistance policy, in which all these questions were already there, including one about using debt for development purposes, which was the second concern of Daniel, how to use debt for development. And it was always of the belief that that could be done. This was at a time, you may remember, there had been a report in the United States, a Metzler report, grants versus loans. that was arguing that we should stop making concessional loans because arithmetically, a concessional loan is a combination of a grant and a market loan. And he was saying, Metzler and the Metzler report was saying, instead of doing concessional loan, it's much better to focus on grants and let the markets do the loan. They have a better knowledge of how to make loans than development agencies. And of course, that was highly debatable, and Daniel wrote papers to debate on that, and we together also with Helmut Reisen wrote a paper on grants versus loans in which we argued that there were ways to think about loans in a much better way and see how we could focus on helping development. And that work led to also working with the AFD on specific debt instruments. And the idea was to introduce an innovation with contingent loans. And what Hélène described was a first attempt to put in practice this idea of contingent loans. I'm still of the belief that all these issues are with us. They have not been addressed. We were together in a seminar with Ishac a few days ago. And what struck me in the seminar, I don't know for you, Ishac, but what struck me is that all the questions that we debated were debated in a different context, but these were the same questions. And that's fascinating about this history of development assistance, in which there are deep technical and political questions there. And one of the technical questions is how to use financial instruments for development and how to conceive official development assistance as part of this effort and not as a distinct area in which there is a development policy that ignores how financial markets work. That was what Daniel was trying to do, and I think it was very successful and very inspiring. And I agree with everything that was said. What struck me immediately in our early discussion in 1980 with Daniel was his willingness and capacity to use economics to address deep questions and to start from the questions, not from economic modeling. He started from the questions and then tried to find out how economic thinking and economic academic work could inform these questions. And I think that's an inspiration for all of us. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Richard Fortes.
Find a place to put this up here.
Yes, okay, I can do this, I think.
Well, let's see if it'll work. The problem, but that's okay. We'll get there. I'll be okay, I think. I have a prepared text for two reasons. One, so that I don't get too emotional, and two, so that I don't digress. And I'm tempted, sorely tempted, by what Thierry said about buybacks, because this is something that I had worked on with Barry Eichengreen, looking back at the buybacks in the 1930s. And I never believed in the Boulot-Rogoff paper in the first place. And I was very pleased when Thierry and Daniel wrote that paper about buybacks. But I will resist that temptation too. So I will read my text, but we can talk about this afterwards. So Daniel Cohen has left us, but he's still among us by the force and generosity of his personality and his contributions to economics and economic policy. Daniel was a remarkable economist and an intellectual, both narrowly as a thinker, researcher, and writer, and more broadly, of course, as a public intellectual, known to and influential for many through his books and appearances in the media. His work was both deep and wide-ranging. I shall focus on what we did together, but I'll start with a paper that he wrote on debt in the very first issue of Economic Policy, the journal that CEPR launched in 1985, of which I was a founder. Economic Policy commissioned Daniel to write how to evaluate the solvency of an indebted nation. This paper was so lucid and far-reaching that I taught it for many years to both master's and PhD students. It has now 140 Google Scholar sites, highly creditable, though not as many as his 1982 paper with Jeff Sachs on LDC borrowing with default risk. Together, Daniel and I wrote 3 papers and a lengthy report on various aspects of sovereign debt. The first was in 1990 on the pricing of sovereign debt. We found a unit elasticity with respect to LIBOR for the average across countries, price, and for pooled data. The other common factors were not correlated with world macro variables, and we called these factors systemic risk. The price of short-term debt was influenced neither by systemic risk nor by economic factors specific to the debtor country. We conjectured it was driven by local political risk. When it is serviced, long-term debt payments reflect the country's resources, export prices. The decision to service is contingent on systemic risk, which alters on a period-by-period basis the incentives for debtors to service their debt. This was an example of Daniel's willingness to engage with the data and use econometric procedures, leading to results that have policy implications. Then in the early 2000s, we returned to sovereign debt, first in a report for the Conseil d'analyse économique, Dette, Prévention et Résolution. This seemed to have some influence on the French position in the debt restructurings of the period immediately after the rejection of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism and the move towards collective action clauses. Our two subsequent papers were interesting examples of Daniel's and my own view that one had to take market assessments seriously. One, on the lender of first resort, started from the establishment of a threshold of sovereign spreads, above which a self-fulfilling vicious spiral ensued. We concluded that the IMF should intervene when spreads passed that threshold to avert the spiral and allow time for corrective policies. This view that markets can themselves generate a disequilibrium was elaborated in our paper on dealing with destabilizing market discipline. I had long been concerned with macroeconomic disequilibrium, and this collaboration with Daniel enriched my understanding and led to clear policy conclusions. Our analysis and proposals might indeed be seen as a precursor of the latest report of the high-level Latin American Committee on Macroeconomic and Financial Issues to create under IMF auspices an emerging markets fund that would be authorized to make temporary secondary market purchases of sovereign debt of a group of emerging market countries where there is evidence of financial contagion effects unwarranted by the fundamentals. Beyond our academic and policy collaboration, there is, of course, the deeply personal viewpoint. I reflect on the life and career of this extraordinary colleague and dear friend with pride that we worked together so well. In theory and in practice, Daniel always sought the best among the possible equilibria. Let his engagement inspire us all. He was a wonderful friend and indeed, above all, a mensch.
Alors, Alexandra Roulet was a student of Daniel, and thankful to Alexandra, I was saying that there are lots of very successful students of Daniel. Alexandra, I think 3 days ago, got the equivalent of the John Bates Clark medal in the French one, the meilleur jeune économiste. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Martin. So indeed, I think I'm here just as one of the many students of Daniel. I'm one of the many that chose to pursue a career in academic research because of Daniel. I was hesitating between becoming a civil servant, more directly working in public policy, or taking the route of academia. And so I met Daniel as a student at the École Normale, and clearly his enthusiasm and all his talent just opened the way. I think Daniel is really the epitome of what economics can offer at its best. So it is very, very rare to combine both being able to publish, very influential academic article, being a teacher that has had an impact on so many generation of economists, being indeed an institution builder with the Paris School of Economics, being the epitome of economics in the French public debate. So, for layman citizen in France, you say economics, they think Daniel Cohen. But also being a practitioner and being an advisor, both in the private sector and in the public policy sector with also politicians, just being recognized as one of the most talented in all these various lines is really totally unique. And on top of that, and maybe because of that, it has been said in all the testimony, his human quality were just incredible, his generosity. And so I think, you know, in all the sadness that has, of course, totally taken us with his passing, I think the joy of hearing all these testimonies and, you know, being able to gather together and feeling part of all these communities that he has built, and they are actually, you know, they are intertwined communities through various links, just give us the strength to continue. And as a former students, just give us the momentum to try to behave in a way that could make him proud. So I think that his spirit will continue to be with us for the rest of our career.
And that's Ngozi Okonjo, co-founder of the lab, and that's you.
Hello, everyone. I had the unique chance and opportunity to work almost on a daily basis with Daniel for almost 20 years. First as a student of his on this very same campus, then as one of his colleagues in advising governments throughout debt cycles, and third as a partner together with Ishac and Martin through this unique adventure of setting up the FinDev lab remotely during COVID. I traveled the world with Daniel at the service of governments in difficult situations to bring his skill set and defend their interest. I had the chance of being with him in Greece, working closely with George Papaconstantinou at one of the roughest moments of the European construction. I had the chance to work with him on one of the very exceptional buybacks in Ecuador following one of the kind default situation related to an unwillingness to pay. And I also, and this was my last experience with him, had the opportunity to work closely with Governor Addison, who's here, on a unique situation of domestic debt restructuring in Ghana that was very close to his heart, a case where he went into the trenches and wanted it to be complete quickly. If I were to summarize what I keep from Daniel, I would say a suitcase full of books whenever traveling, a modernity in his thought leadership and his approach to others, as Dr. Ngozi was saying, at the image of the 18th century humanists, a unique energy to talk about Argentina, balance of payments, about Djokovic last game, and about Pauline's math exams, and an ability to build bridges between discipline, between people and activities. And this is reflective of his approach to sovereign debt. I mean, he combined his academic knowledge, but also his grasp of the policy dimension and of market dynamics. I'm sure that today, Daniel would have been proud of us collectively. First, for Alexandra's big achievements. Second, for this great conference that Martin and Ishac put in place. And third, for all the contribution to the policy debate. Thank you all for being here today.